Cool, so on to our metal section here. We've got a base shader assigned, and you can see we've got our Gnomon shader ball. And what I want to do to really start out with any sort of metal is take my diffuse all the way to black and take my reflection all the way up. This is actually really nice, like black glossy paint, but to really turn this into metal, we can just start with some chrome. We can unlock our Fresnel and really crank up our value pretty high. So this is a really beautiful just chrome. We've got our Fresnel IOR sitting at about 6. And you can see we can just start taking down that reflection glossiness, and we'll start getting the feeling of a nice brushed aluminum or something like that. This would be a nice shader for something like clean silverware, in your kitchen, or whatever clean piece of metal that you have. But let's turn it into a little bit more detailed of a brushed metal texture. So I'm going to open up Photoshop and make a quick texture, and I'll just speed this part of the demo up, but basically it's going to be opening up Photoshop. We're just going to go ahead and create some fibers, and then I'm going to give this a quick motion blur. Something around in there. You can see we've got that nice lines up and down. And then I just need to make this tileable real quick. And there we go. So let's get this saved out. We'll drop it into our metal section, and this will just be saved out as a TIFF, and we'll just call it brushed. And cool. All right. So now back over here, actually didn't even turn off my IPR. This brushed metal texture is going to go into our specular color. And we may want to try it in the, out in the bump as well, but for now let's just try reflection. That's feeling pretty cool. The UVs are definitely doing some weird stuff on this, so that may not be totally desirable, but we can see what we can get. That's actually kind of cool. Feels like it was kind of carved out there. And we can try some other specular modes with this as well. This new GGX specular is pretty nice for metals. And I can also try a little bit of anisotropy with this as well. So I would want that anisotropy to follow the lines of my brushed metal texture. And again, this is just like the cloth. This is going to be kind of difficult to see in this lighting setup. So I am going to want to go over to my sun and sky and see if I can tweak that with a little bit harder of a specular. So that's kind of cool. But it's not totally matching. So in this situation, we can try going in and creating a place 2D texture node and see if we get any change by mapping in the actual UVs of the object, which we did. And so now we can see that that's actually matching the placement of the UVs, which is good. We can try negative as well. That's kind of interesting. That feels like it's pulling across the surface of them, which is kind of cool. And maybe I want to tile my brushed metal a little bit more. That's feeling very nice. And, I just went in and created this thing. I didn't remap any values on it, so I may actually want to go in here and adjust this a bit. So I can use my good old remap. And I could lift up those blacks a little bit. So that feels kind of cool. It keeps it a little nicer, a little cleaner. Cool. And now I can start grunging this up a little bit. And maybe I actually want to do a little bit sharper specular. It's kind of interesting. And maybe I can even rotate this object around a little bit, see how it's feeling. So see, I'm really torn on that specular. I'm kind of feeling now that it should. Let's see what it looks like with the blend. We can also try giving our brushed metal the same texture into the bump as well, because I feel like it's definitely feeling a little too smooth, even though we've got our specular sorted. So let's just map that right in. This is going to be way too intense, and we can dial that way down. So that'll naturally pull some of that specular across the surface. So maybe we'll bounce that a little higher. So I'm going to go ahead and flip back over to my master layer here and get back in the studio environment. Definitely going to still need work on that anisotropy value, but we can work on that as we develop the shader a little bit heavier. So our brushed metal is feeling pretty good. It's feeling okay. Let's go ahead and rotate our shader ball back. Cool. So what I want to show is, you can actually build out a shader pretty quickly without even painting textures and just using these tilables. So on this brushed metal, we'll just grunge it up a little bit. So start out, I can just bring in grunge texture that I've got for everyone. So just a couple of them here. And, so something, actually, so this is actually based off of metal, which is great. So I'm going to bring this in. And again, I'm going to use the remap trick. It's not even really a trick. I'm just going to use this remap technique to go in and be able to adjust the values where I want them. I can even set that to maybe exponential up. And then I can pull these white values around. So I can start trying to clamp this pretty good. Okay, so now we can try that. So I can go in on my remap. And because this is going into reflection color, I can actually just take this texture. I can map it directly into my color gain if I want to. And I'll get that texture running across the surface of the object. Beautiful. And I immediately can see that it's a little heavy-handed for sure. I do have the ability to tile this. I believe the one I grabbed is tileable. Yep. The UVs on this object are pretty bizarre though. Probably need to work on that. I think I'm getting a mirrored set there. Should have checked it a little bit better. It's definitely a little bit more obvious now that I'm working with it. But you can see I'm not even painting textures here, and I'm able to start getting some pretty interesting results with just mapping in some textures. There's some other options. Instead of just doing color gain, I can also create a multiply divide. And I can choose to multiply these two together in this way instead. That's a little bit cleaner, a little more obvious. If somebody else was picking up your file, they would definitely be able to see what was happening, whereas the color gain could be a little hidden. So that should look the same. And there we go. Sweet. So I'm just going to get the UVs sorted here. Cool. So since I adjusted the UVs a little bit, they actually ended up rotated a little bit differently. So I do need to go in and set my rotate frame back on that. And there we go. So let's graph this shader. And we can go in and actually layer up a little bit of rust on top of this as well and start building this out even more. So let's create a V-Ray blend. And I'm just going to create another V-Ray material. And I could go in and paint this out so that I have, all of the rust built into one map so that I have a Fresnel map and, a reflection map and diffuse and all of that good stuff. But a lot of times I will choose to just use a V-Ray blend material because it's easier. And there's a lot of situations where artist time is more valuable than render time. That being said, there's a lot of situations where you really need to optimize and get everything figured out. So always consider, the choices you're making. Keep in mind that you may need to rethink your strategy if something is not going to work out. So let's create a file texture here. And I'm going to bring in, I've got some Rust loaded up. I like this kind of muted one here. And I'm going to go ahead and toss a texture input gamma. And let's map that in as my coat material. Set that to full. We'll get our base material here. And I'm just going to swap in, we'll delete this shading group. We'll swap in my blend material right there. Cool, so here's my Rust. And while I've got the Rust loaded up, I'm actually just going to go in and dial this around a little bit, again, using my remap textures. So I'm going to insert color remap, going to reconnect my diffuse color. I'm actually going to start by just trying to get a little bit of specular on this, which sounds kind of weird. Rust actually has almost no specular, but I always like there to be a little bit of something. So I'm going to crunch in my blacks. So something around in there. So there's just a little bit of a glimmer. And this little bit of glimmer I can change to be similar kind of color as my Rust. You could also you can try an opposite color like a blue or something, whatever you feel is good. I think it's nice to go in and make these choices more creatively rather than going in and thinking about what's physically correct all of the time. There's plenty of situations where you need to be physically correct, but when you're going in and just learning look development and creating these shaders, do some cool stuff and break out of the box a little bit. So I'm going to make that my reflection color. So this will start out pretty shiny. And I'm actually going to stop this. I should have done this earlier. I'm going to make some render elements. I do like seeing what my contribution is. There we go. So we've got GI lighting, reflection, refraction, specular. I don't need refraction right now, but we might be doing some glass stuff, so I'll get into that. Okay, so we'll restart my IPR. I'm going to readjust my bounding box so I'm not looking at all that black. And now I'll turn that back on. There we go. Cool, so now I have the ability to actually see what the reflection is up to, which looks like nothing, which is good to know. Because of the color management, I wasn't actually seeing anything, so I'm just going to bring this down. There we go. So that's kind of cool. And maybe we can saturate that a little bit. Awesome. And now we can see what that looks like again with my diffuse turned on. So in these areas where there feels like there's almost a little bit of metal on top, you can see in that specular and in that reflection, we'll just get a little bit of a glimmer rolling across the surface. And I can turn the glossiness down pretty low, and I can really use this amount slider to dial that around. Cool. Let's go ahead and get a bump map in here as well. So I'm just going to duplicate that file texture, figure out where it went. There we go. Connect that guy in, and then I can insert a color remap again. Just set that, try out the smooth. And I want to try clamping a little bit of those brights. And now I'll get this mapped in to my bump map. There we go. So a little bit too heavy, so maybe we can dial that down a bit. Still too heavy. And there we go. It's feeling nicer. So great, so I've got my bump. My rust shader is officially sorted, and now I can figure out a mask to use for my metal shader. So I'm going to go ahead. I have very nice grunge map already ready to go. And this one right here. So this is actually a Rust with an alpha. So I'm going to open that up. And I can actually choose to just take the alpha of this. So we can say out alpha and put that into my blend amount. So I'm going to hold shift and middle click drag that over, and I'm going to say out alpha into blend amount 0, red, green, and blue. And now I've taken that alpha and laid it across over top of this. So that could be better. Looks like we're getting a pretty nasty seam right across the front. So maybe I do want to use something that is tiled, 0.5. Use something around in there. That's working better. So that's pretty cool. Maybe we can try a different one. This can all just be about exploration. So I can just load up a different grunge. So that would actually, that one right there would work. Even something like that could work okay. That one would probably be a little busy. Let's try this one right here. This is actually the same one we used down there, I believe. But I'm going to keep this separate in case I want to tile it differently. And I am going to insert a color remap. I am going to refresh this swatch. And I'm just going to drag this around and get everything looking pretty good. And again, because I believe I have a color management correction, I'm just going to connect this immediately. I actually kind of like what's going on already. We can try clamping this down a little bit more. Very nice. So now Rust eats away at metal, so you could try inserting a V-Ray bump material. And you could use the same mask, but do a negative bump. And we can just middle click drag that right into our surface shading group. And now we'll just get a little bit of a lip on the edge of that rust. It's a little intense right now, so we can dial that down. That number can be pretty low. And cool, pretty awesome. So you can see this is a really nice example of how to really layer up these complex materials. So I'll just call this rusty metal. And now we can start up on a quick galvanized metal. So I'm just going to assign a new shader. And on this one, let's graph this out. Let's create a file texture, and this one will be a little bit simpler for the galvanized. Imagine that you can use the exact same techniques of applying grunge or rust to this one as well. But we can just load in our single galvanized texture, and we'll go to our metal folder. So there's some base metals here you can play around with. I'm just going to grab my metal galvanized. This one's kind of interesting. Let's try this one. And I'm going to connect that. This shader, I wanted to show galvanized metal because galvanized metal, I do actually use a bit of diffuse. If you look at some reference of galvanized metal, they actually cast shadows. You can see there's quite an intense diffuse value to them. This is not purely reflective. It is still very reflective, but there's a diffuse quality to it, the way they create it. You can also see this is a little bit newer and shinier. This would have a lot less diffuse. And then this also would have significantly less diffuse. But I'm going to go for this kind of older, dirtier galvanized. So let's go ahead and just connect that into our diffuse color. And let's go ahead and get our texture input gamma on that guy. And we will also just go ahead and lower that down a bit. and we'll crank up our reflection, get that nice soft reflection going in there, and we'll start cranking up our Fresnel as well. So maybe something around 3.5. So I'm still going about creating this shader the same, but I'm going to do some work on the specular glossiness. I probably should have adjusted the glossiness on the other metal as well, but we'll start it with this one. So again, I'm going to duplicate this out, connect our same place 2D texture. But on this one, because this is going into our scalar values, I'm going to turn off the texture input gamma, and I'll be able to insert my color remap. So if you notice right now, I've got a reflection glossiness of 0.6, give or take. So I'm actually going to try to have a low value here of 0.55, and then a high value of maybe 0.7. And we'll see what this looks like. I'm just going to drag this right in to my reflection glossiness. This to me is one of the key aspects of this galvanized metal, because you want to be able to feel the texture in the glossiness amounts. So, I could also try raising this a little higher. So see, now it's a much sharper reflection, and I'll still have a mix of soft and sharp, but so this would be cleaner. And I do want to bring that back down a little bit. And I could also even try, maybe I leave this around 0.75, and down here we lower this a little bit more. So this one can be 0.5. So that's kind of cool. So you can see this is really, if you look right here, I know it's very small and subtle, but it's little things where you start pulling out the shape from your texture inside of your glossiness. So I can bring these forward as well and start clamping things down. So there's a harder contrast between the values. So see, now it's really starting to come out. I really like that. So that's perfect. Honestly, that would be a really wonderful start to a galvanized metal. I don't even need to do too much more to this. I'm going to bring in a file texture to grunge up the specular color a little bit. This one I feel is really nice. I don't even need the texture remap for this one. I can just drag it right in. And maybe if I go in and, bring up that tiling a bit. Pretty awesome. Very, very cool stuff. So, now I've got those almost kind of smudgy, dirty bits running through the specular. And I could even use that same mask to layer on a little bit of dirt running into those same areas as well. But get the idea. So you can, the sky starts becoming the limit with some of these shaders. So I encourage you to just keep experimenting and bring in these tileable textures, and you can build all sorts of shaders this way. So we'll do a couple more material types coming up.